Good evening. You guys are making me hungry. I'm David Axelrod, the director of the Institute of Politics. And tonight we're pleased to welcome Julie Hirschfeld Davis and Michael Shear to the IOP for a discussion about their new book, Border Wars, Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration. And let me just say a word about each of them. Michael covered the White House when I was there. And I can attest to the fact that he irritated me from time to time, which means that he did his job right. Julie was working the White House, went over to Congress for the Times, now on the desk, overseeing congressional coverage, both really first-rate reporters. So we're honored to have them here tonight. This conversation will be moderated by Adam Chilton, the professor of law and the Walter Mander Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. Julie and Michael's book will be available for sale outside. You may have seen them set up out there, and they'll be signing copies after the program. Just a word about upcoming events. Our winter fellow, John Bowman, will host a students-only discussion, and John, I should point out, is the president of the Shriver Center for Poverty Law. We'll host a students-only discussion called Bringing Down the Hammer, Pros and Cons of Litigation, to discuss how litigation can harm vulnerable populations and how lawsuits can be deployed to enhance community power. On February 19th, historian and author Blair Amani and illustrator Rochelle Baker will sit down for a conversation on their new book, Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream. And on February 24th, join us as we welcome Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants and one of the most dynamic labor leaders in the country, for a conversation on the future of organized labor with Steve Greenhouse, a former IOP fellow and the former longtime New York Times labor writer. To learn more about all our upcoming events, please visit our website at politics.chicago.edu and sign up for our newsletter, if you haven't already. And before we get started, I just have a few of the now customary housekeeping notes. After the discussion, we'll open up the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind the microphone in the center aisle. And remember, everyone's welcomed at the mic, but as usual, we'll prioritize student questions for the first three questions, and I'll ask, as I have before, that we alternate men and women in that line. One thing we don't want to hear is your cell phone, so if you haven't silenced it already, please double check and make sure that you do. And now, to formally introduce our speakers is Sophie Hare. Sophie is a first-year student from Santa Fe, New Mexico. She's studying public policy and has done a number of things at the IOP, including a recent trip to Iowa to observe the most desultory caucuses in the history of American politics. But that's a whole other story. Please join me in welcoming Sophie to the podium.
Hi. We are pleased this evening to welcome two Washington reporters from the New York Times, Julie Hirschfeld Davis and Michael D. Shear, for a conversation on how President Trump and his administration have approached immigration. Julie Hirschfeld Davis is the congressional editor for the New York Times. She has covered politics from D.C. for 2 decades, writing on Congress, 3 presidential campaigns, and 3 presidents. Before joining the Times, she wrote for Bloomberg News, the Associated Press, the Baltimore Sun, and Congressional Quarterly. She has won the Everett McKinley Dirksen Award for Distinguished Reporting of Congress as well. Michael D. Shear is a White House correspondent for the Times Washington Bureau, where he covers President Trump with a focus on domestic policy, the regulatory state, and life at the White House. At the Times, he has covered the Obama presidency, including the 2012 campaign. He previously spent 2 decades at the Washington Post, where he was a member of the Pulitzer Prize-winning team that covered the Virginia Tech shootings in 2007. Our moderator this evening, Adam Chilton, is a professor of law and a Walter Mander Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. His research studies the intersection of international law, comparative law, and empirical legal studies. Among his current research projects is an effort to study the effectiveness of constitutional rights at improving the protection of human rights. Please give a warm welcome to Julie Hirschfield Davis, Michael D. Shear, and Adam Chilton.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. So thank you for those great introductions. The one part that might be relevant about myself that was left out is at the law school, I teach immigration law and international trade law. So whatever you might think about Trump's policies about whether or not they've been good for the country, for me, they've certainly been good for business because there are suddenly so many students, people that are generally engaged in what our immigration laws are, what's wrong with them, how they could be improved, and how Trump's policies have been affecting them. And the book that we're here to discuss tonight is an amazing behind-the-scenes account of exactly what's taken place, starting before Trump even officially announced his plan to run for president, through the campaign, and through roughly April 2019, all the twists and turns of Trump's immigration policy and law along the way. And in essence, it's a story about how immigration became the issue that propelled Trump's campaign, then became the defining issue of the first term of his presidency, but also how it's been an issue where it's been a constant source of frustration for President Trump as he's been unable to accomplish many of the goals that he promised in his campaign and that he's continued to push for since being elected president. Now, I wanted to start out by asking where you begin, which is before Trump's election and before the campaign, and instead to start all the way back to the, let's say, roughly 2013, when Trump is first starting to give speeches and inching towards running to president. And at the same time that Steve Miller, Steve Bannon, and Jeff Sessions are having meetings talking about whether or not immigration can be used to be an issue in the national politics and being a driving force in national politics. And so what I wanted to ask to start is, to what extent is this an accidental marriage? And something that could have easily gone in a different direction? Or how should we think about how this all came together?
So thanks for having us. It's great to be able to come and talk about the book. It's a good question, how this all sort of began. And I do think an accidental marriage is not a bad way to put it. I think what you're referring to is we talk about in the book, in 2013, a dinner party that Steve Bannon hosted at his townhouse on Capitol Hill, where he invited Jeff Sessions, who was then a senator from Alabama, and Stephen Miller, his young aide, who had been doing communications for him and who had been helping him think about immigration policy and think about an immigration agenda. And what the three of them were talking about was, this was at a time, a few months after the Republicans had failed to win the White House in 2012. The entire Republican Party was sort of in upheaval about what their future was, and the sort of conventional wisdom was, and the party's consensus at the time was, that they lost in 2012, that Mitt Romney had lost because they had failed to have a big enough tent, they'd failed to have wide enough appeal, and what they really needed to do was expand their tent in various ways, but one of the ways was through embracing comprehensive immigration reform, which many Republicans had been against. Some had been for, but much of the party, and Mitt Romney's candidacy, if you recall, he talked a lot about self-deportation. He had clearly been on the other side of that issue, and the consensus was that in order to survive in a country whose demographics were changing, Republicans really had to come around on that issue. The three of them thought that was completely wrong, and basically their conversation was about how their theory of the case was that the reason that Mitt Romney had lost is because a very important strain of voters, white working class voters, had rejected him as a globalist, as an elitist, as somebody who didn't have their interests at heart, and that the real way for Republicans to win would be to make common cause with that group of voters, to reject globalism, as they described it, to have a populist platform that was anti-immigration and anti-trade in many ways, protectionist, and that was about talking about ways in which immigrants could be a threat security-wise and economically to native-born Americans. And so the title of the chapter of the book that deals with this is called The Vessel, because what they were really looking for was a person who could carry that message. And they actually even talked at dinner about maybe Jeff Sessions could be that person, but Sessions kind of demurred and said, it shouldn't be me. But that was the beginning of them really looking for someone who could take this message and carry it. And Trump's name never came up during that conversation. They talked at one point about Lou Dobbs, who actually is quite a close ally of President Trump. But talks about immigration in similar ways. And I think none of them realized it at the time, but what we document in the book is that at the same time, Trump was sort of flirting with the idea of getting involved in politics, and this was very much an ingredient in his public rallying cries that he would take around the country. And so, they were sort of thrown together. Not until a few months after that dinner did it become clear that Trump could be that person, but they were about the business of trying to find who could take that message.
And I think, Julie's right, and I think that what's important to remember is to put yourself back in that moment in 2013 and how audacious it was what these guys were sort of talking about doing, right? They were three guys totally on the fringes of American sort of Republican politics at that moment, right? They're not in the center of the discussion. They're not the decision makers in Congress. They're not the people running the Republican Party. They were complete outsiders and the sort of bomb throwers who were always trying to get the party to move in their direction, but with no success. And they had this idea that I think the dinner was like a 4 or 5 hour long dinner, and the whole idea was we could take back the party, we could take over the party if we had the right person, and sort of shift the party back away from this, approach that was going to be more open to Hispanics and minorities and others, and sort of yank it back. And nobody, if you had asked Julie and I or David in 2013, at the beginning of 2013, oh, is it not working? Uh-oh. I'll have to go sorry. Testing. Okay. I can also yell.
You're doing pretty well.
Oh, the internet, right? Now it's stuck.
Here, I'll hold this.
Yeah, okay.
It's booby trapped.
Booby trap. Okay, we're gonna leave that. I really got stuck. Okay, there it is. All right, I'm free. All right, so anyway, if you had asked David or Julie or I or anybody in Washington in 2013, would this work? Would these guys be able to sort of shift the party back? I think everybody would have said no. And so what's really remarkable is, as Julie said, they were looking for the vessel, they find Trump, and over the course of as we document in the book, over the course of 2013, 2014, 2015, as Trump prepares to enter, that accidental marriage ends up coming together, and in ways that they couldn't have even dreamed possible. And of course, ultimately, it works.
So it does seem just so implausible that you have these outsiders that are not in the mainstream of the party that also have a different diagnosis of the failures of Romney, of essentially everyone else in the party, and the person that they find to be the standard bearer for the message is, the host of The Apprentice. And this all comes together in this way. Now, one thing, once they finally do find Trump to be the vessel on this, that you point out in the story is, at least initially, really before the announcement, but there are times where Trump almost forgets to mention immigration in his speeches, or doesn't seem particularly focused on it as an issue, and they're afraid that maybe this will not become the animating issue that it does. And now, of course, later during the campaign, Trump embraces the Build the Wall chants and saying that there's rapists and bad hombres and everything else that are coming through our borders. But a question is, how much is this that they pushed Trump towards these messages, that Trump was already there, that Trump was sympathetic to them, and does it matter? Because I remember a lot of the time during the campaign we spent debating, does Trump really think this? Does he not think this? Is he a racist, or does he just play one at rallies? And I'm curious what you think about what he thought and whether or not we should care what his views were.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's interesting you brought up that he was the host of The Apprentice, because I think one thing that Trump had, as a candidate, had going for him was a real sense of what entertains, what appeals, what gets a rise out of people. And that was a lot of what animated the way he ran his campaign. He thrives on the feedback loop that he gets from audiences, and so he was very sort of Pavlovian in his in the way that he would organize his campaign speeches. He would talk about things that would get the biggest responses, and then he would sort of hone those messages and try to make sure that he was appealing to people. That was what he ultimately wanted to do, and they loved the event, and they loved sort of the raucous nature of it, and he loved it too. But he is not a person who, despite his TV experience, he doesn't go by a script. So it is the case that very early on when he was thinking about running, his advisors realized that they were going to have sort of a mnemonic device, a way for him to remember to talk about immigration. Now, I don't think that it was that they were pushing this message on him. I think this message came very naturally to Trump. It was something that he would talk about a lot. At the time of that Bannon dinner, he was known in the political realm primarily for having pushed these claims that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. And this whole birther movement that he was in many ways the biggest spokesman for nationally was something that his advisors saw as an important part of his political brand, and realized that you can't run for president on a platform of the last president who's not running for election wasn't legitimate, but they wanted a way to appeal to those same voters and that same kind of group of people, and in many ways I think they felt that his immigration message would do that. And so they had to figure out a way that Trump would not forget to talk about these things, because when he talked about it, they all thought he was really effective at it. He really got people riled up, he got people angry, he got people in some ways a little bit afraid, and so he started going around talking about offense. And they thought, he's a builder, right? So he loves to talk about how he makes things bigger and more beautiful than anyone else. And so if we can get him to talk about this barrier, about this structure, then he'll remember to start in on this immigration message of immigrants are taking your jobs, they're threatening your communities, they're changing things in ways that are not good for you. And it worked. And initially he would talk about the fence, then he started with the wall, and the Build the Wall chant sort of almost rose up organically, and he loved it. And so it kind of served its purpose as a mnemonic device. After the first few rallies with the Build the Wall chant coming back at him, he would never forget to talk about it again. And it's not that he didn't believe in it. I think he really does and did believe in the idea of a wall, both in the sort of practical, sort of substantive way of you build a wall and then people can't come in, but also as a symbol of what he was about. He was about, I'm going to close us off, I'm going to protect us, I'm going to keep people out. That's going to be my message, where everyone else is talking about something totally different.
Yeah, and I think we say at one point, when his advisors were first sort of pushing the wall as an idea, that it was like pushing on an open door, right? This was not something they were fighting Trump to do. It was something that came very naturally to him. We get asked a lot the sort of question, I think, implicit in your question, which is he a racist? Is he a xenophobic person? I think as sort of journalists, we shy away from necessarily coming to a hard conclusion about that. I think we generally say that his views are clearly bigoted, and that he's driven by a lot of bigoted sort of, his actions or exhibit a lot of bigoted tendencies, and that where that comes from is a sort of question that I'm not sure we're necessarily necessarily the right people to answer, but it clearly manifests itself in both the campaign that he waged and in the presidency that he now runs.
And I think, just to add one more thing, I think it does matter, whether he meant to or didn't mean to. I think clearly these are his views, and this is his vision for how the country should be. But I think the essential thing to understand about Trump is that he understood that it was effective for him politically. And so it almost didn't matter to him whether this was going to work, whether it wasn't going to work. As he gets sworn in and he starts to realize that these things don't actually work the way he thinks they do, it doesn't matter to him because he's now locked into this message and understands that it's almost a political imperative for him.
Yeah, one of the arguments that you make in the book that I thought was particularly interesting and persuasive is that during the campaign, when Trump would say something particularly shocking about immigration, he would frequently, despite being implored to apologize or to walk back the statements, refuse, in part because it was such a good differentiating issue between him and the other roughly 15 candidates, whatever it was that was running, from Cruz and Rubio and Bush, et cetera, that he would be the one person that was clearly a differentiated product that would not just have globalist views on immigration. Now, the way that you tell this, it's a persuasive account that you could think the immigration story just explains the primary success. But of course, these things are not monocausal. There's other reasons too. He's willing to say other things that are provocative, shocking, funny, entertaining, whatever it may be. So to what extent do you think that immigration explains the primary success, at least, or explains the success in the Republican primaries, that is? Because if you read the immigration account in the book, it's an immigration story, but obviously in context, how big a role do you think it plays?
I mean, look, I think clear. I mean, as you say, there's Donald Trump's victory in the primary and then his victory in the general election was a complex web of things. I think Julie and I, part of the reason we decided to write the book was that I think we feel like that message, maybe along with trade, are the two most powerful messages that he had. Especially in the primary campaign, the immigration message really did serve to differentiate himself from the other Republicans, who many of the leading candidates, of course, were part of the Republican mainstream that had thought very different things about immigration, and so that served to put him kind of to one side. I think it was a big part of it.
I will say, though, I think, if you look at, we tell a story in the book about early on in the primary, one of these restrictionist groups, Numbers USA, they do like a grading card for all the Republican candidates. And it was not the case, actually, that Trump was the best rated by this group. He was actually kind of in the middle of the field. I think Ted Cruz had their top rating at the time. I was shocked by that. Yeah, and he had a C-. And so he sent one of his aides, Sam Clovis, to Washington, to Arlington, Virginia, where this group is headquartered, to meet with the head of it, who's a guy named Roy Beck. And he sits him down and he says, how can we improve our grade, and what is this about? And Beck says to him, listen, here's this list of 10 policies that we have been advocating for years. These are things like enhanced security at the border, but also cuts in legal immigration, mandatory E-Verify, which is a system where employers have to check the immigration status of everyone they hire, all sorts of agenda items that Trump was not talking about at all. He says, nowhere on this list do you see build a wall. Nowhere on this list do you see call Mexicans rapists and criminals. Like, it's not here. You don't get any points for that, right? So that was what was grabbing the headlines. That was what Trump was known for. But this guy was saying to his staff, you don't actually get any points, any substantive points on the policy front for doing any of that stuff, because it doesn't actually accomplish what groups like ours want to accomplish. And so what I think was pivotal in the primaries for Trump was not so much the substance of his policy proposals on immigration, but the way that he was willing to talk about them. It wasn't so much that people liked his point-by-point analysis of how you handle immigration. It was that he was the guy who was willing to say, burn the system down, this isn't working, I'm willing to offend people and say things that no polite people want to hear, so I'm your guy. So it was almost a message of, leave your party aside because they've been betraying you and selling you a bill of goods for decades, and go with me because I'm willing to say what you really think. And that, I think, was very appealing to Republican primary voters.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to make the point that Julie just made at the end there, which is Bannon and Miller and the people around Trump also, who were around Trump during the campaign, understood that the power, at least the political power of the immigration message, didn't come from, chants at a rally, mandatory E-Verify, like it wasn't going to happen. That wasn't where the power was, and that in some ways, the immigration message was a proxy for a lot of other things, right? It was a proxy for the fear that you had about your job insecurity and the fact that you wanted somebody to blame for the fact that you didn't have the job security that you wanted to have. And who are you going to blame? Well, you could blame the immigrant that's coming in. And so they were particularly effective at crafting an immigration message that had political power in that moment, not so much for crafting an immigration plan or a detailed set of proposals, which we can get to in the discussion later, but obviously then causes them problems when they're actually in the White House and suddenly are in charge of actually crafting policy, and they don't know kind of they know what they would like to do, but they don't know how to do it.
Yeah, let's fast forward to exactly that part of the story. So cut to November 2016. It's now election night. Trump's elected. And whether or not it's because of superstition, short planning, or rational investments, Trump does not invest in having a transition team in place going into this point. Now elected, and has to figure out what to actually do to translate some of these campaign messages into actual substantive policy and into actual change. And so I thought it might be useful to focus in on the first policy that got a lot of attention after Trump's elected, and the first immigration policy, which is the travel ban. So how exactly did the travel ban come to pass, and how did we get to that chaotic January weekend in 2017 when people were showing up at the airports not knowing if they could get in?
Yeah, so as Michael just said, they had made a lot of promises that it wasn't clear how they could deliver on, and one of them was when Trump started talking on the campaign trail about a Muslim ban. And actually at the time, there were some Republicans who had been thinking about border enforcement and immigration enforcement and security vetting of people who come in and out of ports of entry in the United States for some time, who panicked when he started talking about a Muslim ban, because they thought this is fatal for the Republican Party. We can't be known as the party that wants to ban Muslims. But what they did was they kind of got to work, and they came up with a memo for him on, okay, you gotta stop talking about that. But if you want to start talking about better vetting and stricter policies for who we let in and how they gain access to the United States, we can do that, and here's how you do it. And this group actually included Rudy Giuliani, who would later go on Fox News and say, I'm the guy who taught him how to make the Muslim ban legal. That's where that came from. Mike McCall, who was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee on the House side in Congress, and a few others who really tried to sort of massage this into some workable way of doing things. But as you said, instead of actually planning for a regular transition, Trump did not think he was going to win. He was superstitious. And he got to the week after winning election, and he essentially had to go from a cold start putting together this team of policy people who could write this into some sort of an executive order or a set of policy proposals that could actually either pass Congress or be implemented quickly. What they did was they assembled some of the aides who had been working on these issues on the Republican side in Congress for some time, a guy named Gene Hamilton, who also worked for Jeff Sessions in his Senate office. Steve Miller was a big part of this. Steve Bannon was a sort of overarching presence, although he wasn't really doing much on the details because he didn't know very many of the details. But they basically set to work trying to put together a big array of policy prescriptions that could be used to accomplish what Trump had been talking about on the campaign trail. Keeping more people out, vetting people better, and particularly restricting immigration from Muslim-majority countries. And they came up with a huge list of policy proposals. And one of the people we talked to described it to us this way. He said they thought they were putting together this kind of menu of an a la carte menu for the incoming president of things that you could do on immigration and on visa issuances that he would sort of choose from. And instead of doing that, he ordered the all-you-can-eat buffet. So they just sort of like took it all and crammed it into an executive order, which would then become the travel ban. And because they were suspicious about the people who were working in the White House when Trump came in, because they thought that they were a bunch of Obama holdovers and deep state people who were out to, sink his agenda, they didn't put it through the National Security Council vetting process. They just kind of went forward with it very quickly without much vetting. And we tell the story in the book of there had been whispers. We had started reporting on the fact that there was going to be this travel ban. We'd all started hearing from sources that this was under development. And everyone's trying to get a copy of it. I mean, we as reporters were, but people inside the government, inside the Department of Homeland Security are like, have you seen this thing? We got to see this thing. Nobody had seen it. And they finally get a hold of it on a Friday in January. And they're going over it in this big conference room at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters in Washington. And there's one guy on a teleconference who was at the time the head of Customs and Border Protection, Kevin McAleen. He would later become the acting secretary. And they're reading through it, and everyone has huge concerns. It's like, well, does this affect green card holders? And what's going to happen to people who are already in the air? And what about if you're a relative of someone? And they're all scribbling down like all the questions and issues that have to be raised before this thing can go into effect. And McAleen says, hey guys, from the teleconference screen, he says, I'm watching CNN and the president just signed this. And that was it. Like, that was it.
Yeah.
No, it was unvetted, and then it was all of a sudden it was in place.
And we, just to add a little bit to the story, we describe in some detail all of what Julie just described, that sort of week that we were hearing things through the, in the press, was really just the first week of the Trump presidency. I mean, this is Friday the 27th or 6th of January.
Yeah, 27th, after he's been inaugurated.
After he's been inaugurated 1 week, and, we describe one of the National Security Council lawyers talking to another person and saying, we just got this, we were told we have 43 minutes to review it. We talk about the sort of...
That's all it really takes to review an executive order,
43
right?
minute, right, to review a...
Their effort showed in this case.
Yeah. And I think the outcome of that was that, for us as reporters, in the hours after the president did sign it, we're frantically calling the press office, then Sean Spicer, saying, what does this do? In fact, we even...
It was actually kind of funny.
For hours, we kept saying, what countries are affected?
Because it was a citation. It was a citation of the U.S. Code. It didn't list countries, so it just cited a section of the U.S. Code, and we're all like trying to look up in the U.S. Code. And then we call the press office, okay, I found this section. Is it like Yemen and this and that? And they're like, we don't know.
I think so, but we don't know. So it was about as chaotic as for us, kind of from the inside watching it, as it was then that next day, the Saturday, when all, as we mentioned, the people that are arriving at the airports, and suddenly the TSA agents and the other agents are having to turn people back, and it became a very chaotic thing, and it was born out of this very unusual and and rushed process. One thing that Julie didn't mention was that Steve Bannon was his idea and Miller's idea, really, both of them were what Bannon called shock and awe. The idea was, to push through all of these really extreme, drastic measures on immigration as a way of shocking the system, both externally, the political system, the public, into realizing that Trump really wanted to do what he had said he was going to do, but also to shock the bureaucracy, to sort of show the bureaucracy that, it's a new day now, and this isn't just going to be a kind of slow-moving kind of process where you sort of slowly move the steamliner. It was going to be something that was going to happen quickly, and the result of that was all the chaos that we found.
Yeah, no, it's a great account of what I think really was a shock and awe, shocking event. One of the reasons it was, so shocking and seemingly so chaotic is, as Julie mentioned, the term immigrant is a term of art that means someone that's moving to the United States permanently, so it means green card holder. And if you were to just literally read the text of the travel ban, it appears to read that people that have a green card cannot come, and people that do not have a green card maybe can. And so the assumption that I think a lot of us on the outside had was the version of the story that Steve Bannon and Miller are these two figures that by themselves, with no help and no assistance and no knowledge about the details of how immigration law actually works, are just writing up this sort of campaign-style speech, or not speech, or policy proposal, or whatever. Now, one thing that I learned from the book that I did not realize is that it wasn't Miller by himself, and he had assembled this team of various other people from the Republican congressional offices, various think tanks, NGOs, et cetera, to be part of a group that put this together. So I was shocked to learn that many minds had edited this.
Some of them lawyers.
And not just one,
yes.
Some of them lawyers. Right.
But again, they didn't necessarily think, not that this excuses any of the shortcomings of the policymaking process, but many of them did not actually think that this was actually going to become
final
something.
document.
You know, that this was part of the a la carte menu. This was not the.
All right. Yeah. So that's an argument you hear a lot with. We just heard this with the Iran strike. You know, in November, that we just gave Trump a menu
Yes.
of options. How could we have known what he would pick?
Of course, it's easier to know 3 years in than
That-
maybe it
that's
would have
right,
been
yes.
7 days in.
That's right. Maybe the first time we should give a bit of a pass to the people that gave this a la carte menu. But all right. So the question I wanted to sort of concretely ask about this. How should we think about the people behind the scenes during this travel ban period and then moving into the early year or so of the Trump administration? Is this Bannon and Miller totally in sessions driving the ship, or is this a concerted group of people that are all on the same page and having the same goals? To what extent is Kelly, at the time the first Secretary of Homeland Security and then later Chief of Staff, part of this process as well? Who's driving this?
So it changes over time. It evolves over time. Bannon is involved for the first 6 months and then ultimately leaves and has input from the outside some. Miller is really the architect of the whole thing. I mean, I think it's fair to say even to this day, whatever it is, February today, he's really the driving force. Kelly, interestingly enough, is one of these really complicated characters who sort of is viewed when he both starts at DHS and later when he moves over to the White House to become Chief of Staff, is viewed by some people as somebody who knows a lot about immigration because he served, in senior roles in the military in kind of
CENTCOM.
at CENTCOM, they call it, in Central America, the Central America Command. So he's viewed as somebody who kind of understands the issue and is going to be more moderate on the issue, somebody that's going to limit Trump, going to hold back Trump's kind of instincts. As it turns out, he doesn't become that person. And in fact, I think if you read our book, what I think is clear is that if anything, Kelly ends up being as aggressive, if not even more so in some ways than Trump, maybe not more so, but it's certainly as aggressive as Trump, and really an enabler on a lot of these subject matters. And then the final point, and maybe Julie has some thoughts, is that you have the sort of that top sort of political cadre of political folks, and then you have a bureaucracy that is in some ways very resistant to at least the process, the lack of process. You know, part of what happens in any bureaucracy, and certainly in the government, is they get used to a sort of system, a way of doing things that doesn't necessarily move things through quickly. And so you end up having at DHS and at the State Department and at a place called USCIS, which handles the sort of legal immigration system in the country, you have people that in some ways actually don't disagree with some of the president's end goals. Some of the people in those positions would like to see certainly less illegal immigration, even in some cases a slower legal immigration system. But they're also kind of wedded to a process that ends up frustrating Miller, frustrating the president, because it doesn't move quickly. Many of these people are lawyers. They sort of get that you gotta jump through the right hoops, and the travel ban ends up becoming a sort of object lesson throughout the government of the way to do it wrong. And so you have this tension between Miller and the president, who are sitting in the White House saying, why aren't these things getting done? And some of the people in the bureaucracy who are saying, yeah, but you gotta jump through these hoops and it takes time.
Yeah, and I mean, so Miller, in addition to having sort of stood up this transition effort to write all these executive orders, including the travel ban, he then sets to work putting together what was essentially sort of a think tank, informal, unofficial think tank inside the West Wing on immigration. And it's mostly people whose names you wouldn't recognize. I mean, it's this guy, Gene Hamilton, who used to work for Sessions and had a hand in the travel ban, who was then at the Department of Homeland Security, later went on to the Department of Justice. A guy named Andrew Vieprich, Francis Cisna, and he would basically have these weekly meetings, and they would talk about all of the ways in which they could clamp down on immigration, legal immigration, illegal immigration, refugees, what have you. And so because he had this single-minded focus on this issue, Miller was really quite influential in being able to reach into various agencies, and he would like pick up the phone and call the Department of Homeland Security and ask for, low-level people, give me the number of such and such and so and so, like how many people are arriving with this characteristic, or how many criminals have been, thrown out of the country this week. And people, I think, very quickly began to realize that this is a person who has the ear of the president. He has huge influence in the West Wing. We do not want to cross this person. If he asks us for a piece of information, if he asks us to execute on something, we do not want to be the people to get in the way. And that, despite the resistance, which Michael mentioned, which was real, I think that was also a pretty powerful force. The other thing is that was a dynamic inside the West Wing. Stephen made it very clear that he wanted to be the uber immigration czar of everything inside the White House. And so Gary Cohn, who did not want Stephen Miller meddling around in trade stuff and other economic stuff, would basically say, like, okay, you take the immigration stuff. Let me have my stuff. And H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor, did not want him meddling around on Syria and Iraq and all those sorts of military issues. And he would be like, okay, you want refugees? Fine, do refugees. Because they all knew that this is a person who the president trusted and had bonded with on this issue. And they just did not want to get in the way of what he was trying to do.
And just to give you a quick anecdote about Stephen Miller's power and the kind of message that got sent across the bureaucracy, there was a fellow by the name of Larry Bartlett who worked for the State Department and in the refugee and was sort of overseeing a lot of the bringing of refugees into the United States from around the world. And Larry got crosswise with Stephen Miller because at a series of meetings he pushed a study that had been done actually by HHS that concluded that refugees actually are a net economic benefit to the United States, that when a refugee comes, they actually are a benefit to the United States. That did not sit well with Stephen Miller, who completely disagreed with that and thought that was exactly the opposite of what they wanted to try to accomplish. Stephen got that study shelved so that it was never released. But more to the point, Larry Bartlett, who had been a very senior person at State, I mean, this is, in charge of the refugee programs, essentially, suddenly found himself in the FOIA office doing Freedom of Information applications, then shipped off to Puerto Rico and then to Turkey, and suddenly was just gone. And so
he's back, actually.
He's back. He did come back eventually, but throughout the government, you didn't want to be Larry Bartletted. You didn't. That was sort of, it was clear through that and through other things that Stephen had, if you crossed Stephen Miller, that was not going to be good for your career.
All right, so I want to, sticking with some of the characters involved in this story and the key players in this story, ask a question that maybe is something about the sourcing of the book, which is, so you have these great behind-the-scenes accounts of what took place at meetings, and in some of these meetings it'll be a cabinet meeting or with many people in the room. In other discussions, it's a pretty small group of people that must have been on given phone calls or in given meetings. Now, the way that the story unfolds is that Miller throughout is pushing this agenda in a pretty ideologically motivated way. He wants to restrict immigration, wants to reduce refugees, build the wall, et cetera, et cetera. But for instance, the two successors to Kelly as secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security, first Duke and then Nielsen, both of them get a pretty relatively sympathetic treatment where they come off as people that are conflicted about some of the orders that they have to sign. In Duke's case, to rescind DACA and the temporary protected status for a few but not all countries. And then in Nielsen's case, we have this for the decision to separate children from their families, where they both endorse these policies, but are able to say that they weren't fully on board, or maybe they were pushed into this, et cetera. So why the sympathetic treatment for some adult cabinet secretaries that decided to sign memos with these consequences?
I mean, I think the difference in portrayals between Miller and the two of them, I would chalk up to their kind of views and feelings about these policies. Stephen Miller has zero conflicts about any of these policies.
Doesn't seem that way, yeah.
He's not conflicted. And, if he were sitting here right now and you were asking him, he would say, I don't apologize for anything. This is the most successful policy there's ever been. He might say that we had some bumps in the road with the rollout of the travel ban, but for the most part, he has zero conflicts about any of this. Both of those people did, and many, Kelly also, we talk a lot in the book about how Kelly spent a lot of time trying to get Trump to stop talking about the wall because he realized that the wall was like kind of a meaningless thing, it was impractical and all the rest. Nielsen was a person who I think is really interesting to look at because I think she is the profile of a lot of administration officials in this administration. She had worked for the George W. Bush administration. She was kind of a mainstream Republican. She was not a super hardliner person on immigration, and yet she found herself as part of a White House team that was presided over by a president for whom this is the most important issue. And so she signed right up, and she did what was asked of her. And even though she didn't necessarily agree with every little policy prescription, at a certain point you get to a moment where you either have to resign or you own it. And that's what happened to her with the family separation policy. She had this memo sitting on her desk. It had been signed by 3 senior people at her agency. It was clearly in line with what Jeff Sessions, another not conflicted person who had put in place this zero tolerance policy, had asked for, and she could have resigned. She could have said, screw this, I'm not doing it. And ultimately she felt pressured to sign on, and that's what she did. And so I think that is, one of the subplots of this administration in various other areas other than immigration, but certainly on immigration, is people react in different ways. We didn't encounter very many people who resigned in protest of any of these policies. Duke was the acting secretary, so she ended up getting cycled out sort of in the natural scheme of things, and I think from our reporting seemed relieved to be able to do so. But I think you have to tease out and explain to people what the nuances are, that some of these decisions that people made in the name of the Trump administration were not necessarily things that they agreed with, but they were things ultimately that they were willing to do, and that is the name of the game when you work for an administration like this.
And I think it's interesting, it's your takeaway of, especially when it comes to Nielsen, of it being a sympathetic portrayal of her, I think is interesting because in my thinking, and I think we've talked about this a lot, she comes across in a very complicated way in the book, because the family separation policy, while she is conflicted at the beginning, as Julie said, she ultimately decides to both sign the memo and then
to be the public
to
face,
be the public face of it and to defend it. And to this day, I mean, she's given a couple of interviews now since, big interviews since she left government. She continues to insist that that it was never a policy intended to separate children, and all of the arguments that she makes, which I think we show.
We document that it actually was.
We document in the book
Yes.
very clearly that it was, in fact, intended to separate children and the whole from their parents and the whole thing. The thing that makes her, I think, a complicated figure is that I think she comes across during the family separation period as this person who ultimately caves in and embraces the policy in the defense of the policy. But then later on, she becomes the person who, more than anybody else, privately is pushing back against a president whose ideas are becoming more and more and more extreme. So whether it is a president who is constantly telling her, I want to build this wall that has spikes on the top so that people will get maimed if they try to climb over it, or I want to build a moat and put alligators and snakes in it along the entire border of the United States and Mexico, which he raised repeatedly, and she would have to, in fact, she at one point said, he raised the idea of a moat so often that he had to...
Trench. He would call it a trench.
He would call it a trench, a moat, but that she finally had to go to the Army Corps of Engineers and get a cost estimate, and then came back to him and said it would actually cost 2 to 3 times what the wall would cost, and he finally, okay. But another example for her, there was a moment later in the sort of period that we write about, in which it's right before the 2018 midterm elections. He's talking about the caravan, the caravans that are coming up from Central America to the border. There's an incident in which some of the migrants have thrown rocks at them. He's deployed the military to the border, and some of the migrants have thrown rocks at some of the military. And he goes on and gives a speech and says, if migrants throw rocks, I think the military should treat them as rifles, essentially making the suggestion that the military should fire on the migrants if they're thrown rocks at. And that the moment that he says that, inside Department of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen, everybody goes nuts. I mean, the idea that the President of the United States was suggesting that they shoot to kill, essentially, migrants. She orders that the use of force policy is found for Customs and Border Protection. It says, show the president, you have to convince him that he has to walk this back. This can't stand. Ultimately, he does sort of kind of publicly say, all right, well, fine, we won't fire on the migrants. But as we documented in the book, later, privately, he's meeting with Kirstjen Nielsen and some others, and he comes back to this question of firing, and he says, okay, fine, we won't shoot to kill, we won't shoot the migrants, and then says, but we can shoot them in the legs to slow them down, right? And Nielsen has to say, no, sir, no, you can't do that either. And that becomes a pattern for her, repeatedly trying to push back, whether it's his idea of shutting down the border entirely, which he raises repeatedly, the size of the wall, different kinds of designs for the wall, and ultimately that's what gets her fired. Ultimately, the back and forth between him proposing extreme ideas and her saying, look, and it wasn't, I think Julie and I have said this a lot, like it wasn't necessarily that she thought the ideas were amoral. Sometimes it was just that they were impractical or impossible to actually do. But for whatever the reason, her repeated attempts to stand up to him is what ultimately gets her fired. And so, she's this kind of complicated figure.
Yeah, the other thing is there's this moment when she finally does sign that family separation memo that we found very telling, where her staff and John Kelly, who is now the White House Chief of Staff, they're all telling her, you don't want to be the face of this. Like, let's let Jeff Sessions own it. Like, let's not be the, And there was they had a whole rollout plan where they had like a press release ready to go and talking points and, a briefing for reporters all planned. And then Jeff Sessions went out and gave a speech I believe it was in San Diego, where he actually mentioned the fact that zero tolerance will mean that if you come to this country with a child, that child can be separated from you and you won't, and then you're going to be prosecuted. And all of a sudden, Nielsen's staff says, hold up, let's just cancel all that stuff. He's just said it. Like, we don't have to say it. He just said it. And they are advising her, do not be the face of this. You don't want to own it. And ultimately, she decides that she is going to be the face of it, but only because she's worried that if she doesn't do that, Jeff Sessions is going to get all the credit. And then she already knows she's on thin ice with the president because she has to say no to him all the time about the wall and other things. She wants the bump. She wants the reputational benefit, which means a lot with this president. And so, I think that's also quite telling about her motives and the motives of the people who work for this president, because they know that the currency of the realm is telling him something he really wants to hear and succeeding with something on immigration that he thinks is a good move.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll move to questions from the audience. And as David mentioned, we'll start with questions from students. But as a law professor, I'm going to take my prerogative to ask a law question and end with that, which is, President Obama, during his first term, tried to pass immigration reform and had a number of immigration policies where he tried for legislative change. And it's in the latter part of his second term, when it's clear that congressional action isn't going to happen, that DACA and DAPA and a number of executive orders are issued to try to make some change and make some progress on these issues. And those are exactly the issues that then the Bannons and Millers at the time and Sessions continually decried as lawless and unconstitutional, and that Obama had usurped and overstepped the Constitution. Now, once Trump is in office, he's tried to get some things through Congress and other things done through executive action. But it seems frustrated frequently that he can't get Congress to do more. Do you think that there's going to be some constitutional consistency in their attitude to what Trump's allowed to do, or should we expect more executive actions on these issues going forward?
I mean, I would expect more executive action for a couple of reasons. One of them is that I think it is easier, at least it has been more readily available to this administration, to make an argument that the Constitution gives the president broad powers on immigration when you're talking about restrictions than it is when you're talking about letting people in, right? So obviously DAPA was struck down and DACA is now being challenged in the Supreme Court, and those are both programs that are geared toward allowing people who are here without authorization, without legal status, to gain legal status. And it seems like the courts have looked much less favorably on that kind of executive action when it comes to immigration than on the other kind, where you're actually saying, for the national security of the country, I think these people or those people or this class of immigrants shouldn't be able to come except under certain circumstances. So I think they think they're on more solid legal footing. Well, I guess we'll see if that's the case. But also, I just think that because this has been an issue that's been almost impossible for Congress to act on for many years, and Trump's presidency has only made it more so because he's made this issue so politically hot, even more so than it used to be. So I would just expect nothing to happen in Congress.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. So we switch to questions now from the audience. Do we have questions from some students? If you do, please line up here in the middle and come up to the microphone and ask Julie and Michael what you're curious about.
Hi, my name is Estrella, and I'm a first year at the college from San Antonio, Texas. Something that you mentioned was the culture of fear that has really permeated current discussions about immigration and policy related to it. And actions that we've seen from this administration, like the travel ban, as well as the rise of domestic terror incidents like the El Paso shootings. Do you feel that there's any immediate solution, be it for the duration of this administration or within the next 10 years, to kind of shift this culture or to make discussions about immigration more related to the policy issues at hand rather than this abstract fear of immigrants taking jobs or harming US citizens?
So I wish I could say that I think we're optimistic that the discussion will become more sort of policy-based and fact-based and sort of more of a kind of thoughtful discussion. I mean, in part, that was part of why we want to write the book, is that I think, to sort of offer some fact-based story that people can sort of help to add to that discussion in a thoughtful way, and I hope we did that. But I actually think that, as Julie kind of mentioned at the end of her last answer, if anything, I think we think that Trump's campaign and his presidency and the way they've approached this and the likely way they're going to continue to approach it, both in the campaign over the next 8 or 9 months, but also if he were to win a second term, I think has really polarized this issue more than going the other direction. So it's hard to see. I mean, obviously, politics is a complicated business and things change quickly, and maybe there will be something that will come along to surprise us. But at least at the moment, it feels like both in the policy realm, the sort of discussion and debate around the immigration issue in Congress and kind of in the policy-making sphere, but also in the political sphere out in the country as people are debating this issue, it feels like they've gotten further apart, not closer together, and that the discussion is more heated, not less, and less fact-based, not more. And it's hard, I think, to see it moving in the other direction.
I also think it's partly an issue of, obviously many Democrats and even some Republicans and independents have pushed back on Trump's approach to this issue and made it clear that they don't agree and talked in positive ways about immigrants and immigration. But in a lot of ways, Trump has been able to have a relatively uninterrupted and unchallenged megaphone on this issue, in part because Democrats are talking about other things. They're talking about healthcare. They're talking about economic issues. We don't see a very robust debate among Democrats right now about what a positive, affirmative immigration reform might look like. You don't hear, there's not a lot of at least amplified conversation of what a different vision for talking about immigration policy would look like. And I think if that were to bubble up and start to gain some traction, then you could actually have a real conversation. I don't think it would stop Trump from talking in the ways that he talks about immigrants and immigration. But if you look at some of the public opinion polling, the vast majority of the American public thinks positively of immigrants and immigration. They do not support a wall. They support admitting refugees. If you go down the list, I think there's ample support in this country for some of these principles, but you're not hearing as much about it on the other side. So I think if that starts to happen, maybe the conversation changes a little bit.
And just real quickly, also, Trump has pushed to the extent that the Democrats have talked about immigration recently, he's pushed them to the left, right? So you've seen the abolish ICE kind of message, you've seen the open borders, the Castro talking about decriminalization of border crossing and the like, which, again, not to sort of weigh in on whether that's good or bad, but it's definitely polarized. It's definitely much less where the Obama administration was in 2013 when the Senate passed an immigration kind of overhaul, where kind of the two sides had sort of managed to sort of eke their way towards an overhaul that obviously died in the House, but at least you sort of felt like the political process was a little closer together, and now it feels further apart.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Hashim. I'm with the Rise and Study Group from Toronto. The question I had, you kind of touched on it a bit, was about the weaponizing the border, especially during the campaigns and when any of the candidates address it. So I just wanted your thoughts on the implication of that, as in it's now constantly in play with any candidate, anyone that's in the field, and what does that have to, like, the implication that's going to have on the future of the border, like continuity going forward? Like, how long would a policy stand or an executive order stand, or something that one party says, how fast will it be reversed based on the new standard that is now set by Trump?
Yeah, that's a good question. For some of the executive actions that we've seen taken, it wouldn't take very long at all for a president of a different party to come in and deactivate it. There hasn't been any legislation passed. Like we said, I don't think either one of us expect any legislation to be enacted, sort of codifying the weaponization, as you're calling it, of the border. That would be a lot harder to unwind if they did do it. I do think that, and this was the case in 2013, and then years before that, when I was first covering immigration reform in Congress in 2006, 2007, that you can't have a conversation about sort of broad changes to immigration policy in this country anymore without talking about border security. I mean, all of those statistics I just quoted about people who, support immigrants and immigration, and they don't support a wall and all those things. But if you ask the vast majority of Americans, they do support border security, strong border security, and in some cases, stronger border security than we have right now. I think there has been sort of an obfuscation of what that actually means. This president has really focused on the southwestern border, but the vast majority of immigrants coming into this country are coming through ports of entry that have nothing to do with that. They're coming through airports. They're coming with visas, and in many cases, they're overstaying those visas. So I think, weaponization of the border is probably a good way to look at the way that he has talked about the southwestern border, but there's a broader set of issues that I think you're going to continue to hear talked about that need to be addressed when you talk about how to make a functional immigration system.
And just to add one thing, which is that if you talk to the real experts, the people who have been in this kind of immigration world and the policy world for decades, not just the last couple of years, one of the things they talk about and are frustrated by is that they see actually securing the border and figuring out how to develop an asylum policy that works, a set of asylum rules that work, and there's very few people who think that the system now or 5 or 10 years ago actually worked. Everybody agrees that it needs to be changed, but everybody agrees that that it needs continuity. It needs a long-term, sort of set of policies, and there is a lot of worry about just a ping-ponging back and forth, right? That Trump Trump cracks down and sends asylum seekers to Mexico. The next president comes in and lets them back in, and another president comes and does the opposite, and that none of that solves the underlying problems, the sort of drivers that are pushing people towards the border, nor the kind of legal kind of reforms and changes that really need to be made to make the system work. And I think that is a problem.
Thank you very much.
We have time for 2 more questions. So 2 more.
Hi, my name is Lucas Montoya. I'm a first year at the college, and I'm from Brownsville, Texas. Which is a border city. And the question I had was on the note of weaponizing the border. A lot of times the media shows it as just like a lawless, crime-ridden place. What more can people from border cities do to kind of shed light on that?
That's a really good question. I mean, one of the things that we saw happen in the last year is some of the border state and border city members of Congress who want to show that there's a sort of a whole culture and a whole different dynamic than what gets paid attention to when the president is talking about immigration, and tried to organize congressional delegations to go down and actually look at it and see it for what it is. Michael and I went to San Diego we had actually, neither one of us, we spent months working on this book, and then we realized that we hadn't actually been to the border to sort of check it out. So we went and we crossed on foot into Tijuana and went to some of the shelters where asylum seekers were. And what was striking to us was the sort of ways in which those two communities are so intertwined, people just crossing to go shopping, to go to their doctor, to go to their dentist, to drop kids at school. And I don't think that that's very well understood, except in the communities for which that is a daily reality. So I don't know what the answer is. I think it's important for more Americans to realize that. But I think it goes back to the question about, how do you counter the message that the president has. He has a very loud megaphone, and I think it's incumbent upon those who disagree with him to figure out ways of grabbing some of that for themselves.
And I think one thing that we still don't know, so Trump's immigration message worked for him in 2016. That same message of sort of fear and loathing and danger and warnings in 2018 didn't seem to work as well for him politically, right? There was obviously the Democrats did really well certainly in the House, and there was a sense that certainly among some of the Republicans that Trump's sort of hardcore anti-immigrant message really backfired in a lot of those districts, especially some of the districts that kind of were along the border. So that may be at least an early indication that there is some recognition in the public that the sort of grim picture that the president paints all the time isn't necessarily the complete picture. I think one of the interesting things that Julie and I will be watching in this upcoming presidential election is which of those two things happens this next time. Does Trump revisit all of these same themes and it works for him because it's a presidential year and it's different than a congressional midterm, or do we see a kind of a reprise of him trying to use these themes and issues but they don't work as well? And that may give you a sense of whether or not people are buying the story that he's selling.
Hi, I'm Kenneth Newman. I'm a local resident of the area. The DHS just announced that ICE is going to be sending agents to sanctuary cities. Chicago is a city awash in guns. There's a lot of gun smuggling that comes here. Growing up down here, I'm aware of the shootings. So knowing that ICE agents sometimes go on raids without identifying jackets, and there's plenty of undercover Chicago cops, and then lots of residents that own guns, could you see a shootout happening between Chicago police and ICE agents? I mean, I'm serious.
Gosh, I hope not. I mean, if people aren't familiar with what the gentleman is talking about, there was we broke a story on Friday that this elite tactical force, which is the same force, if anyone remembers the whole Elian Gonzalez raid, The same guys who did that are now going to be apparently deployed to what Trump calls sanctuary cities, cities that basically don't help federal immigration authorities carry out detainer requests to help make arrests. And one of the possibilities is that there are unintended consequences. Of course, even if there are no unintended consequences, that does sow a lot of fear in a lot of communities in this country where people are, they may have legal status, they may not have legal status, maybe they do and their parents don't, maybe they do and their friends don't. It creates a lot of tension and drama that is going to be real for a lot of cities around this country. I do think that it's worth noting that Trump talked about carrying out big deportation raids right when he took office, and they did do a certain amount of raids, some workplace raids and some sort of arrests in cities, but it actually ended up being a lot more small scale than he had characterized it, and I think some of these things tend to be for the bang of the message and the signaling to his base and to people who care that we're going to do this and we're going to be tough. And this may be one of those instances, but I guess we just don't know.
And then just as a final thing on this, to piggyback on Julie's idea, if you had to sort of summarize what Trump's immigration message was from the campaign, it was a sort of anti-illegal immigration message. And in fact, he's sort of talked repeatedly, given speeches, he loves legal immigration. He wants to increase legal immigration. And yet, a lot of it, when you sort of look back at the last 3 years, and Julie was just looking at, we were just looking at some of these numbers, when you look back at it, the sort of moves that he's done on illegal immigration have ended up being much more symbolic. There's a lot of bang and flash and shock and awe and announcements like this one with the tactical people coming, and a lot of talk about the wall, much of which hasn't yet been actually built. And so when you look at the illegal immigration numbers, they sort of spiked way up. They're now back down some, but they're sort of kind of where it was when he came into office. What's really striking is the legal immigration that, what did we say, is down 11?
So he basically, when he took office, so we're now at about 1% below what border apprehensions were when Trump took office. We are, depending on how you count, anywhere from 7 to 11% lower on the legal immigration side than when he took office.
Which is, we always think of what the Trump administration has been trying to do over these last 3 years is to turn every immigration dial to zero, right? Like that's their goal. Every spigot that, involves people coming to this country, whether it be through refugee programs or visas or crossing the border illegal or being an asylum seeker, they're trying to turn that spigot off. And in some cases, or at least down as far as they can get it. And the real striking thing is to me anyway, and I think to us, is that he's really had more success on the legal side, slowing the process down, shutting some of those programs down. The refugee program, which Julie actually wrote a lot about in the first 2 years of this administration, the Obama administration had reached a high of about 110,000, allowing about 110,000 refugees in their final year to come into the United States. This was at a time when the Syrian civil war was at its peak. There were millions of Syrian refugees trying to flee from that country. And the United States said, okay, we'll take up to 110,000. The Trump administration, the travel ban, cut that to 50,000. The next year they went to 30,000. This year they're down to 18,000. And they're at a level where the people who run the refugee programs essentially say that it's sort of headed towards kind of being a sustainable program, because you get so low that you can't actually, sort of take many people. And so I think that's the striking thing, is that they've sort of managed, started out in a kind of bumbling way with the travel ban, but over the 3 years have managed to figure out how to take a lot of those switches down.
So we're going to have to end there. I had about 20 more topics that I wanted to ask about, and so we didn't get to them, which means there's a lot more in the book that we didn't cover. If you are interested in immigration generally, or just want to understand how this administration has worked, I'd highly recommend the book. It's got a lot of behind-the-scenes anecdotes and information about the way that policy is made, or more often not made in these cases. And then finally, Michael and Julie are going to be out back signing copies of the book and selling copies of the book. But let's end by thanking them for coming here and joining us in February.